The moment the boardroom went silent, everyone could see it. The CEO of a billion-dollar company stood frozen, refusing to extend her hand to the janitor's son standing before her, unaware that the man she just humiliated held the deed to everything she had ever built. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and stories that restore your faith in humanity, hit like, drop a comment, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Kindness Heart Stories before we begin. The late morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrington Tower, casting long golden rectangles. Across the marble lobby where Grant Whitfield stood clutching a worn manila folder against his chest. He had rehearsed this moment for 3 days, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in his small apartment, practicing the words he would say to convince someone, anyone, at Harrington Innovations to give him a chance. His daughter Nora, 7 years old with gap-toothed smiles and a habit of humming while she colored, was the reason he was here instead of at another rejection interview across town. She was the reason his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his only clean tie, one he had ironed carefully on the kitchen counter that morning, with a towel because he did not own an ironing board. Grant had once been an engineer, a good one before the company. He worked for Collapsed, under fraud charges that had nothing to do with him but everything to do with the fact that nobody wanted to hire someone whose resume carried the stain of a scandal. 3 years of scraping by followed, 3 years of night shifts, stocking shelves, and weekend gigs fixing neighbors' computers. 3 years of watching his savings dwindle while his ex-wife disappeared further into a life that did not include diaper changes or school pickups. He raised Nora alone, and he wore that responsibility like armor, even when the world seemed determined to strip it away piece by piece. The receptionist at Harrington Innovations barely looked up when Grant approached the desk, his shoes scuffed but polished as best he could manage, his folder containing every certification and reference letter he had collected over the years. He had heard through a former colleague that the company was hiring for a facilities coordination role, something far beneath his actual qualifications, but he had learned not to be picky when a child depended on him. What he did not know, what nobody in that building knew except for a handful of lawyers and a silent trust fund, overseen by a company 3 states away, was that Grant Whitfield was not merely an applicant. He was, through a complicated inheritance, from an uncle he had barely known and a series of investments made decades ago, the majority shareholder of the very company he was about to interview with, holding 60% of Harrington Innovations through a holding entity that had never once used his real name in public filings. Vanessa Cole had built her reputation on precision and control. As CEO of Harrington Innovations, she had clawed her way up from an entry-level analyst position 12 years earlier, and she wore her success the way some people wear armor, sharp suits, sharper words, and an expression that rarely softened for anyone she deemed unworthy of her time. She had inherited her position through merit, yes, but also through a ruthless efficiency that left little room for sentiment. When her assistant informed her that a facilities candidate was waiting in the lobby, dressed in a jacket that had clearly seen better decades, she sighed and told her assistant she would greet him, briefly as a formality before handing him off to human resources. The interaction lasted less than 90 seconds. Grant extended his hand as Vanessa approached, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest, introducing himself and thanking her for the opportunity to be considered. Vanessa glanced at his hand, then at his shoes, then at the folder he carried, and something in her calculated the entire measure of his worth in that single glance. She offered a tight, closed-lipped smile and folded her arms instead of shaking his hand, telling him that HR would handle the rest of the process and that she had a board meeting to attend. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone rushing past, but Grant felt it land somewhere deep, a familiar sting he had grown almost accustomed to over the years, the sensation of being looked through rather than looked at. He did not make a scene. He simply nodded, thanked her again with a grace that surprised even himself, and walked toward the elevator where a young HR coordinator named Priya was waiting to escort him to a smaller office. Priya, unlike her CEO, actually read his folder during the elevator ride, her eyebrows rising slightly, as she noticed the engineering certifications and the recommendation letters describing him as meticulous, resourceful, and endlessly patient under pressure. She wondered quietly why a man with these qualifications was applying for a role several tiers beneath his experience, but she said nothing, sensing that some stories were not meant to be pried into during a first meeting. 3 weeks passed. Grant got the facilities job, a modest salary that nonetheless felt like oxygen after months of financial suffocation. He arrived early every morning, fixed things before anyone reported them broken, learned every employee's name from the executives to the cleaning staff, and treated each person with the same quiet respect regardless of their title. Nora started sleeping better at night. Once she sensed her father's shoulders had loosened. Once the arguments with landlords over late rent stopped happening, in hushed tones behind closed doors, Grant found himself, for the first time in years, allowing himself small moments of hope during his lunch breaks, sitting on a bench outside the building and watching the city move around him. Vanessa, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware that the quiet man who fixed the flickering lights on the 14th floor was the same man whose signature, through his holding company, had approved her own compensation package the previous year. The trust had been established with strict confidentiality clauses, designed by Grant's late uncle to protect his nephew from exactly the kind of scrutiny and manipulation that often followed sudden wealth. Grant himself had only recently been briefed on the full extent of his inheritance, and he had made a deliberate choice, one that surprised even his estate lawyer, to work an ordinary job and understand the company from the ground floor before ever revealing who he truly was. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the building's main server room flooded due to a burst pipe, threatening to destroy years of critical data and delay a major product launch that Vanessa had staked her reputation on. Panic spread through the executive floor as IT specialists struggled to contain the damage, and Vanessa, uncharacteristically desperate, found herself standing in a crowded hallway, barking orders that nobody could execute fast enough. It was Grant who appeared with towels, tarps, and a calm efficiency that silenced the chaos, directing the emergency response with the kind of technical knowledge that no facilities coordinator should have possessed. He rerouted power manually, protected the most sensitive servers first, and saved what would have been millions of dollars in irrecoverable data, all while Vanessa watched from the doorway in stunned silence. That evening, as the crisis settled and employees filtered out of the building, Vanessa found Grant in the parking garage, still in his work uniform, checking his phone for a message from Nora's after-school program. She approached him differently this time, her posture less guarded, and asked him quietly how a facilities coordinator knew server architecture well enough to save the company's entire product launch. Grant hesitated, then decided that honesty, however complicated, was overdue. He told her about his engineering background, about the years of hardship, about raising his daughter alone, and finally, carefully, about the inheritance and the shares he held, the 60% that made him on paper more powerful within these walls than she had ever imagined. Vanessa's face drained of color as the weight of the revelation settled over her. Memories of that first handshake she refused, rushing back with humiliating clarity. She did not offer excuses. Instead, she offered something rarer, a genuine apology, admitting that she had judged him in 90 seconds based on nothing but appearances, and that she was ashamed of the person that moment revealed her to be. Grant, who had spent years being underestimated, chose grace over vindication, telling her that he had taken the job not to test her, but to remind himself who he wanted to be regardless of what he owned. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness matters, and subscribe to Kindness Hearts Stories for more stories like this one. In the months that followed, Vanessa became a different kind of leader, one who learned employees' names and looked people in the eye regardless of their title, while Grant quietly stepped into an advisory role that let him shape the company's culture without ever needing the spotlight. Before we close, drop a comment below with the word kindness if you believe everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not what they appear to have. And so, in a city full of glass towers and hurried strangers, a single father and his daughter found not just financial security, but something far more valuable: proof that dignity, patience, and quiet strength eventually find their way into the light.